I really appreciate being invited to do this. It's such a, being around manifestoists and people who study manifestos is certainly one of my favorite things to do. And it's such a generous, wonderful community. So thank you again for having me. So as David said, I have titled the talk Radical Provocations, Scum, Feminism, and Reading Publics. And I want to sort of think not only about the singularity and significance of Valerie Solanas' 1967 Scum Manifesto, but also significantly the impact of the manifesto, both on the feminist movement and on the art world. So the talk sort of draws from both of these books, but also some other material as well. So and like many of you, I've been interested in not only in the genre of manifestos, their style, tone, brashness, recklessness, bravery, but also on the political impacts of these works. As cultural theorist Teresa Ebert wrote, the manifesto is writing in struggle. It is writing on the edge where textuality is dragged into the streets and language is carried into the barricades. It is writing confronting established practices in order to open up new spaces for oppositional praxis. And unlike most writing practices, manifestos do not require approval, safeguards, gatekeeping, policing to get their message across. They exist as theatrical documents, investing themselves with their own authority. Literary scholar Martin Buchner, who I see has also just given a talk with all of you, which is wonderful. He has said of manifestos, political manifestos frequently overcompensate for the actual powerlessness of their position with theatrical exaggerations, and their confidence is often feigned rather than grounded in reality. At the same time, even the most theatrical avant-garde manifestos achieve some performative effects and left some traces on history precisely through their calculated theatricality. So in light of this, Valerie Solanas is a provocative character in that she wrote a manifesto that could rightly be considered a brilliant work of satire, but then shot Andy Warhol point blank with the intent to kill him. Much debate has occurred about how to contextualize or historicize the troublesome and troublemaking figure of Valerie Solanas, particularly in light of her shooting of Andy Warhol after penning one of the most explosive and impactful manifestos of the 20th century, the SCUM Manifesto. And of course, most of you know this manifesto, but it's always worth revisiting the opening line. It begins with a call to arms for all women. Life in this society being at best an utter bore, and no aspect of society being at all relevant to women, there remains to civic-minded, responsible, thrill-seeking females only to overthrow the government, eliminate the money system, institute complete automation, and destroy the male sex. It was and remains to be one of the most fervent declarations of war against patriarchy, misogyny, and sexism. Solanas imagined an entirely new world, one where women embodied a whole new way of seeing themselves in relation to the shit pile that men have made of the world. Freed of the constraints of men's definitions of great art, money, government, and culture, women could instead become dominant, secure, confident, nasty, selfish, violent, independent, proud, thrill-seeking, free-willing, arrogant females who considered themselves fit to rule the universe, who have free will to the limits of this quote-unquote society and are ready to wheel on to something far better or far beyond what it has to offer. Solanas directed particular ire towards what she called daddy's girls, calling them nice, passive, accepting, cultivated, polite, dignified, subdued, dependent, scared, mindless, insecure, and approval-seeking. In her estimation, the only worthy females were those seeking to pursue their own passions, to eliminate the necessity of work, to engage in friendships with other women, and to destroy anything that could get in their way. She laid out her argument for the necessity of eliminating men. She says, the male is an incomplete female, a walking abortion, aborted at the gene stage. He is a half-dead, unresponsive lump, incapable of giving or receiving pleasure or happiness. Consequently, he is at best an utter bore, an inoffensive blob, since only those capable of absorption in others can be charming. To call a man an animal is to flatter him. He is a machine, a walking dildo. For Solanas, men move through the world trying to emulate qualities they found in women, such as emotional strength and independence, forcefulness, dynamism, decisiveness, coolness, objectivity, assertiveness, courage, integrity, vitality, intensity, depth of character, grooviness, etc., while minimizing traits that they sensed in themselves but projected onto women, such as, quote, vanity, frivolity, triviality, weakness, etc. She further accused men of lacking the ability to tolerate strong displays of emotion, of, quote, having a crudely constructed nervous system that is easily upset by the least display of emotion or feeling. Drawing on their inherent inferiority and worthlessness, Solanus framed men as ushering in death and destruction. She said, the male changes only when forced to do so by technology, when he has no choice, when society reaches the stage where he must change or die. We're at that stage now. If women don't get their asses in gear fast, we may very well all die. She also ends her manifesto with an explicit call for murder. She says, SCUM will kill all men who are not in the men's auxiliary of SCUM. Men's in the men's auxiliary are those who are working diligently to eliminate themselves, men who, regardless of their motives, do good, men who are playing ball with SCUM. She added that SCUM's tactics should prioritize murder over civil disobedience. This is one of, I think, the best lines of the whole manifesto. SCUM will not picket, demonstrate, march, or strike to attempt to achieve its ends. Such tactics are for nice, genteel ladies who scrupulously take only such action as is guaranteed to be ineffective. If SCUM ever marches, it will be over the president's stupid, sickening face. If SCUM ever strikes, it will be in the dark with a 6-inch blade. SCUM will always operate on a criminal as opposed to civil disobedience basis. That is, as opposed to openly violating the law and going to jail in order to draw attention to injustice. Such tactics acknowledge the rightness of the overall system, the very idea of law and government. SCUM is out to destroy the system, not attain certain rights within it. For Solanus, she did not simply take symbolic phallic power. She suggested both in her writings and her actions that women had too long suffered under the misconceptions of their own inferiority and lack of agency. She said of the few stragglers resisting a SCUM takeover, a few of the more volatile will whimper and sulk and throw their toys and dish rags on the floor, but SCUM will continue to steamroller over them. Her final advice to men was, men who are rational, however, won't kick or struggle or raise a distressing fuss, but will just sit back, relax, enjoy the show, and ride the waves to their own demise. Given her interest on self-reliance and her paranoia about formal publishing houses, Solanus originally sold the manifesto as a self-published mimeograph in 1967, charging men twice as much as women, and later published the manifesto in 1968 with Olympia Press following her shooting of Warhol. Ironically, of course, her publisher, Maurice Gerodius, said that even though he had Solanus under contract with the press, he never would have published SCUM Manifesto without the shooting. The attempted murder bolstered Solanus's notoriety and gave the manifesto a kind of new framework of both credibility, did she actually want to murder all men, and madness. It became a symbol of the writings of a madwoman. Debates about the seriousness versus satirical nature of this document have continued for over 50 years. Did Solanus write SCUM Manifesto as a literal call to murder men? Did she intend this document as a satirical Jonathan Swift-style expose? What does it mean that she published the manifesto a year prior to actually shooting Andy Warhol? How is her story further complicated by the fact that both prior to the shooting and after it, she maintained a strange kind of sadistic affection for Warhol, writing him letters addressed to, quote, Dear Toad, and claiming that she would still work on movies with him in the future. In an interview with lefty journalist Howard Smith, Solanus herself claims that SCUM was hypothetical. She said, there's no organization. It's either nothing or it's just me, depending on how you define it. I mean, I thought of it as a kind of state of mind. In other words, women who think a certain way are SCUM. Men who think a certain way are in the men's auxiliary of SCUM. As seen in the rough cuts of the interview, she added, it's just a literary device. There's no organization called SCUM. There never was and there never will be. That said, her shooting of Warhol understandably cast her as forever tied to that act of violence. She became in what would be nightmarish for someone who valued her autonomy and independence from men, colloquially known as the woman who shot Andy Warhol. Further complicating the picture, she seems to have no remorse about the shooting, at least publicly. She told journalist Howard Smith when he asked her whether she wanted to get into a discussion about shooting people, she said, I consider that a moral act, and I consider it immoral that I missed. I should have done target practice. In many ways, though, SCUM Manifesto also serves as a kind of feminist performance art, a creative and intellectual exercise in reversing the types of rhetoric so often directed at women during the period. Remember that these were highly psychoanalytic times in the mid to late 1960s US, ones rife with accusations that all women operated with penis envy, that they were driven to be mothers, that penetrative vaginal intercourse was normal while other types of desires were perverse. and so on. I mean, remember, husbands could routinely call their wives psychiatrists to discuss their progress. Women still struggled to gain entry into elite universities and were often not funded in top graduate programs because it was assumed that women wanted to marry and have children and would therefore be a wasted investment for competitive university dollars. That exact scenario happened to Valerie as well. So Solanus reacted to these contexts by creating a document, perhaps performative more than literal, that espoused the murder of all men, the elimination of the bunny system, the total reversal of higher education as a funnel for making an elite social class, and the creation of a system of what she called the fuck-up force that would undo the damage of a patriarchal society. She turned the tables here. Penis envy became pussy envy. Motherhood was the embodiment of brainwashing. Sex could be conditioned away and forgotten about. Life's pursuits should be about friendship and other secure women. And she says the meaning of life is love. So whether SCUM Manifesto is a piece of performance art or a literal call for murder that she eventually enacted, it became an act of resistance that had far-reaching impacts both in the art world and on the feminist movement itself. In this way, debates about Solanus's intentions matter less than recognizing it as a powerful force in its own right. Radical artists of her time, particularly Up Against the Wall motherfucker, labeled Solanus's shooting of Warhol not as a declaration of war against the logics of patriarchy, but as a radical rejection of Warhol's commodified non-art work. Some considered this shooting the ultimate manifestation of a surrealist act. Remember Andre Breton's famous claim in the Second Manifesto of Surrealism that, quote, the simplest surrealist act consists of dashing down the street, pistol in hand, and firing blindly as fast as you can pull the trigger into the crowd. Up Against the Wall motherfucker published a leaflet titled Plastic Man versus the Sweet Assassin that read, Andy Warhol shot by Valerie Solanus, Plastic Man versus the Sweet Assassin, the face of plastic fascist smashed. The terrorist knows where to strike, at the heart, a plastic inevitable exploded, non-man shot by the reality of his dream as the cultural assassin emerges, a tough chick with a bop cap at 28, the true vengeance of Dada, tough little chick, the hater of men, the lover of man, with the surgeon's gun, now against the wall of plastic extinction. A nightmare with a dead superstar, the Statue of Liberty raped by a chick with balls, the camp master slain by the slave, and America's white plastic cathedral is ready to burn. Valerie is ours, and the sweet assassin lives, scum in exile. In response to questions about how Ben Morea, who wrote this, and it was also a good friend of hers, how he rationalized supporting Solanus, he replied, rationalize? I didn't rationalize anything. I loved Valerie and I loathed Andy Warhol, so that's all there was to it. I mean, I didn't want to shoot him. Andy Warhol ruined art. He said of Solanus and Warhol, quote, aesthetically and ideologically, I would lean much more towards her than towards him. I would vilify him for trying to destroy the creative act and make it a money act. I mean, he really stands out as a negative factor to me, and she does not. SCUM Manifesto and her shooting of Warhol both came to embody a rejection of, quote, great art by men, which was often devoid of meaning, tied to relentless consumerism, and empty of actual creativity. A decade after the shooting, Solanus told her then boyfriend Louise Warren that the only factual reporting about the shootings appeared in True Crime. Look, she said, I'm a revolutionary, not a nut. That kind of thing takes organization. I'm practical, not stupid. Her sister Judith astutely observed that, quote, Valerie did not want to kill Andy Warhol, the individual, but Warhol, the man, the one with the power, the control, the fame, the money, the prestige. Everything came together in one horrendous moment when paranoid delusion fused with intolerable reality. I don't think she planned it. Gerodius was the real target, but for Valerie, everything was her theories. Violence was just something that happened, end quote. When considering the impact of the SCUM Manifesto on the public sphere, however, the greatest impacts could be felt in relation to Solanus's work and actions by the emerging feminist movement of the day. Debates about whether Solanus was sane or mad when shooting Warhol and when writing SCUM Manifesto haunted her later legal battles and ultimately fractured the entire feminist movement. At the time, the National Organization for Women, which had recently began in New York City, had been having fights about abortion rights and how to frame the legal case for abortion, the right to privacy versus something more foundational to women's fundamental rights over their own bodies. now had begun to splinter over abortion rights. As radical feminist T. Grace Atkinson said, everybody in now said they wanted a revolution. Everybody wanted a revolution. I didn't know anybody who didn't want a revolution, but I couldn't understand why every time it came to an action, we would have big fights, even though we all said we wanted the same thing, end quote. Eventually, now determined that they would petition for abortion based on the right to privacy rather than the more radical approach to decriminalizing abortion altogether. So now kept having these internal fights over goals and tactics. And as Atkinson said, Valerie was one of those fights. There was so much violence. You kept hearing things about how many women got killed. Battering was starting to come up and it was being talked about. Women were just the victims every place. And if you didn't want to be a victim, but you saw all of this, it was just overwhelming, real rage, she said. Atkinson first heard about the SCUM manifesto only one day prior to Solanas' shooting of Andy Warhol. She received a call at her home from a Village Voice writer named Rosetta Wrights, a radical feminist and eventual founder of a jazz label, who had allowed Solanas to live with her, asking if she had heard about this document, SCUM Manifesto, and mentioning that it would interest the feminist movement. Wright said that she had feared Solanas' instability, as Solanas had been violent to her, and that she didn't want to live with her anymore. Still, she thought SCUM Manifesto had compelling qualities that would speak to the growing women's movement. The following day, Atkinson saw the news coverage of the shooting and noted that the shooter had told the press, "He had too much control over my life." Solanas had unwittingly found some new allies. She said, "Well, the first thing I thought was Warhol is not exactly the exemplar you choose for white male supremacy," Atkinson admitted. "He was asexual, so I knew it wasn't some personal relationship." This was right after a big New York Times piece on feminism and a lot on me, so everyone was aware that there was anger building around them. The Times presented the shooting as if Valerie was somehow connected to feminism. All I saw was she had shot Warhol. I knew there was exploitation, and it matched because finally some woman had done something that was appropriate to the feelings we were having. She was fighting back. That's what it felt like. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz felt similarly moved by hearing the news of Solanas' expression of rage. Having spent time working with the Martin Luther King Jr. and various Black Panthers, she felt increasing distance from the peaceful strategies of social change. Sitting in a cafe in Mexico City, she had read the headline, "Superwoman Power Advocate Shoots Andy Warhol," and decided to leave Mexico immediately, eager to be a part of what she called that delicious moment, that exciting formative time. When she thought about Solanas shooting Warhol and standing up to patriarchy, she began fantasizing about Solanas as a symbol of women's rage. She said, "I would go to the United States and launch this revolution with this superwoman ideology and also find Valerie. Because I had come out of 4 years of graduate study in history, I thought Boston was symbolically and historically a perfect place. I started calling everyone I knew. We would organize to defend Valerie, and we would take the whole Free Huey movement as a model to create this Free Valerie movement. Everyone was always copying everyone, so it was hard to get a new idea. I was tired of playing the who's more oppressed games in the South and wanted a change," she said. Roxanne became concerned with who would represent Solanas legally, knowing how pivotal legal representation can be in times of social crisis. On hearing about Solanas' arrest for the Warhol shootings, T. Grace Atkinson had an impulse to immediately leave her apartment and head to the courthouse. At the time of the shooting, Atkinson was helping many women get illegal abortions, and people had told her that she would be thrown in jail for it. I can't live with it if I don't do what I can," she admitted. "So I raced down, and who do I see coming up the steps in the criminal court? Florence Kennedy." Flo and I, by then, had the same instinct. Her feeling was, like any Black person she saw going through the judicial system, they're going to be in trouble. They needed help. She was on her way. We were both on our way, end quote. Kennedy, a prominent civil rights attorney, had represented numerous Black Panthers and knew that people in prison needed money coming in from the outside and needed to make it clear to fellow inmates that they had people who cared about them on the outside. She brought legal savvy to Solanas, while Atkinson brought empathy, solidarity, and support. Kennedy agreed to represent Solanas pro bono. Both she and Atkinson were granted the right to visit Solanas in prison soon after the shooting. Kennedy recounted to the East Village Other, "Valerie hasn't lost weight. She looks darling, looks very good, seems to be taking it okay. The average person, you know, is very anxious to get out. Not Valerie. To her, the whole world is a nut house, and she's sheltered from the craziness. The whole world is a garbage pail. There's no pressure now. I tell you, Valerie was in fairly good spirits. She's a damn good fighter. She wants to defend herself. Yes, she doesn't want any legal aid. I took the position that she was very intelligent and best able to fight for herself. One of the best things the oppressor likes for you to do is put up a big struggle, is put off balance when you don't. She advised Solanas to keep responses to the press brief, and Solanas did so, giving only short answers about her defense, insisting that SCUM Manifesto will be my entire defense. To the question, doing any writing, she replied, no. What of Maurice? Skip it. Anything to say to anyone? Skip it. A biographical note? Skip it. And how do you pass the day? Thinking and playing chess, was her smug response. Valerie stayed tight-lipped about her motives and her case, taking seriously Kennedy's advice about not giving the press any information that could get distorted. Notably, radical feminists of the time believed in what Solanas stood for, believed that she could have a major impact on the feminist movement. Atkinson declared, she has dragged feminism kicking and screaming into the 20th century in a very dramatic way. The manifesto is the most important feminist document to appear in the English-speaking world that I know of. Solanas places feminism squarely as the key to any meaningful political and eventually social change. She takes the male chauvinist spiel and turns it on its head. Rightly or wrongly, Solanas has brought feminism up to date for the first time in history, end quote. Atkinson was particularly preoccupied with wanting Solanas to have a good lawyer and adequate legal representation. So she approached NOW and asked for the organization's formal support for Solanas's case. She and several other radical feminists of NOW wanted to provide her with legal aid, and they wanted NOW to back these efforts. Atkinson and other NOW lawyers argued that Solanas's case had a striking similarity to other cases that NOW had supported, particularly cases where women were victimized by either a father or a husband or a mother. While Solanas's case was not based on a sexual connection, there was an economic motive that Atkinson believed NOW should take an interest in. She recalled the reasoning. Quote, from the newspapers, the fact that she would not fall into the usual category of sex-related crime, but an economic one, made her crazy. Whereas men kill each other all the time for economic reasons without such a label, women could not do this. That made it, from a legal vantage point, a sex discrimination case on its face that NOW should look into. I thought that was a rather cool assessment. I was coming from another place, all my rage and so on and so forth. Disagreements about how to proceed with Solanas's case led to major fractures within NOW. Liberal feminists argue that they should stay far away from her case, as they did not want feminism associated with violence or extreme anger. Many radical feminists argued in impassioned ways about how Solanas represented the crystallization of women's rage that they must stand up against, the double standard placed on women compared to the violent men. Radical feminists believe NOW must stand up against the nearly constant victimization of women, and perhaps Solanas represented an effective way to bring all of this mistreatment into the public eye. Radicals also suggested that NOW should support all women, regardless of the extremity of their action. As president of NOW during this time, Atkinson caught heat for siding with and nurturing the radical factions. I was being raked over the coals, she recalled. They tried to impeach me as president of NOW for going to Valerie's aid and all. It's sort of like a Rorschach test, Valerie was. Betty Friedan, before I became a threat to her, was once very supportive and confiding. I remember she was really in a fix once because she had a place on Fire Island with her husband and they had a big fight. She chased him down the beach with a carving knife, screaming that she was going to cut it off. Lots of people saw her, and he was going to bring this up in the divorce proceedings. So she asked me what to do, and I told her, well, there were witnesses, so what can you do? You've got to just brazen it out and just say, I'm a passionate woman. What do you want from me? End quote. I thought that was good advice. So when Betty flipped out at my assertion that there was some connection between violence and feminism, I thought of her chasing her husband down the beach with a carving knife. She's telling me I'm crazy, end quote. Friedan wanted nothing to do with Valerie's case, writing to T. Grace, I don't like the politics of this, and sending telegrams to Kennedy that read, for example, desist immediately from linking NOW in any way with Valerie Solanas. Miss Solanas' motives in Warhol case entirely irrelevant to NOW's goals of full equality for women in true equal partnership with men, end quote. Kennedy responded with quote, Valerie is superior to many of the people in NOW. She already says Simone de Beauvoir, Sartre, and Genet are overrated windbags, so you can imagine what she thinks of NOW. She's worth all the NOW members put together, that's right. The tide of feminism had turned, and radical camps had formed in many places. Dunbar Ortiz had arrived in Boston to form or find a female liberation movement. She had assembled a group that later acquired the name Cell 16, and they read the SCUM Manifesto as sacred text while laughing hilariously at Solanas's wicked satire. This group emulated Solanas by writing and selling their propaganda on the streets of Cambridge and Boston, even charging men for conversation, as Solanas had done. They picketed the new Playboy Club, they studied martial arts, and they roamed the streets of Boston in groups, daring men to be offensive. Groups had also started to form in Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C. After linking up with several of them, Dunbar Ortiz and Dana Densmore arrived uninvited, although they did not know this, to an invitation-only 3-day planning meeting for the National Women's Liberation Conference in Sandy Springs, Maryland. The women at the meeting, though all self-described militants, cowered at the thought of that their feminism might make them be perceived as man-haters. Dunbar Ortiz decided that these groovy women needed a little consciousness raising, so we filibustered, disrupting their rigid agenda and calm discussions with select readings from the SCUM manifesto. They caused a big controversy when, as feminist Charlotte Bunch recalled, they read aloud excerpts of the SCUM manifesto. In fact, Dunbar Ortiz believes Solanas' contribution to feminism was so substantial that she and others of Cell 16 read aloud from the SCUM manifesto as the group's first order of business. The manifesto had become close to required reading among radical feminists within months of the shooting. Dunbar Ortiz was adamant that Solanas' voice would be heard, pleading in a July 5th, 1968 letter to her then boyfriend, quote, "Valerie's is a voice in the wilderness shouting her rebellion, saying she will accept no arguments to the contrary, allow no loopholes or fancy devices that can be used to counter her argument. She is every woman in some basic sense. She is my mother and other broken and destroyed women, a martyr for all women everywhere. In that way, she is not so different from Che. Read her manifesto closely. She wants us to see not a new man, but a new human being created, and now." Rosalind Baxendale, another radical feminist living in New York City and interested in Valerie's case, also felt moved by Valerie's story and had organized a radical feminist group called Witch, the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, to picket outside of Valerie's trial at the courthouse between 6th and 7th Avenues in Midtown Manhattan. Baxendale remembered that they had seminars in which they read sections of the SCUM manifesto aloud in a group. She said, "Valerie was particularly appealing to Witch because of her provocativeness and in the Emma Goldman tradition of will and action. Also, I had always hated Andy Warhol," end quote. She felt connected to Valerie's rage and angry about dismissive characterizations of her as simply crazy. She said, "I saw Valerie as a feminist issue, and I felt that she was cheated by having to deal with these horrible men. Some people said she was crazy, but I thought she was very sane. A lot of people were supposedly crazy, like Allen Ginsberg, and people who had been put in mental institutions weren't crazy at all. They were telling the truth. People who didn't conform were always being labeled crazy then." Having worked at Max's Kansas City, where Warhol hung out, Baxendale observed, "He was just so arrogant with his clique of men who just thought they were so superior." Radical feminist Kate Millett called Solanas' work and shooting, quote, "a female artist driven to terrible lengths by the response or lack of response of the art world around her, and then finally lashing out in this way against a superhero, the leader of the avant-garde. You can see its symbolic level here as someone who writes a manifesto so extreme that most feminists are horrified," end quote. Millett likened Solanas to other extreme acts of activism in earlier iterations of the women's movement. She said, "There was once a suffragette who threw herself under a horse at Ascot in a desperate attempt to get the attention of the government so that women would get the vote. The shooting was like that. I don't think it meant that one had to go and shoot someone to be consistent with SCUM's notions. It had meaning to me, the way that she seemed to represent frustration as the woman artist ignored, driven to a kind of revenge." Laura X, another radical feminist who would go on to lead efforts to categorize marital rape as a criminal offense, also felt admiration for and an alliance with Valerie, using Valerie's words and stories to further radicalize her own politics. She said, "I did not believe in killing people, but like Malcolm X, I thought her analysis was exactly right. All of us understood her analysis of the relations between the sexes. Many just choose to live our lives in a different way. People in the early women's lib movement passed the SCUM manifesto around with great interest and appreciation. It had great resonance with our lives. Valerie Solanas wanted to go against all men. We wanted to go another way, but we understood the betrayal of the men in the civil rights movement. When we combined with that with the experience of women from the suburbs, we had quite a group assembling for the march down Fifth Avenue. Whether or not a woman ever again touched a hair on a man's head, all agreed with her analysis of how men treated women, even if they were philosophically opposed to how she dealt with it." All right, we're getting towards the end here, so I'm just gonna finish this. As one who would later join the New York New York Radical Women, Carol Hainish also felt sympathy for Valerie, claiming that her radical friends felt angry that Andy Warhol promised Valerie Solanas things and then did not do them. She said, "We felt that she had a legitimate gripe with him, a male ripping off a woman. We felt like defending her against him, or at least not totally dismissing her." Hainish felt that SCUM Manifesto had a dramatic impact on radical feminism, in that the passion and outrageousness of it let others be more passionate and outrageous. She saw the truth in the discussion of how men act. Ann Coate, another founder of radical feminism, characterized Valerie's influence by emphasizing Valerie's willingness to express anger towards men. So many women were afraid to be angry. Her coming out as angry was probably healthy, as it let other women come out as angry. Still, Coate feared that Valerie would distort the true goals of feminism and that the press picked her up only so they could dismiss her as a crazy lesbian man-hater. She said she was one of the prototypes picked up to discredit the movement. Speaking of her interactions with Solanas prior to the shooting, Coate recalled, "She struck me as one who self-destructed in a blaze. I could see it early. She had a very driven quality, but she seemed self-destructive. She was more I'm angry, not we're angry. She had a lonely rage," end quote. Solanas' rage, however lonely, did strike a chord with many feminists of the time. A pamphlet that circulated titled Feminism Lives labeled Solanas as a political prisoner and provided more evidence that radical feminists defended her cause. The pamphlet read, "She isn't there, as is commonly thought, directed for any criminal activity, but so that men in power can convince themselves she is insane and force her to shut up, and to show all women the political consequences of speaking their minds before men, or of any attempt by women to define ourselves. This woman with a single book has done as much to bring the cause of women's liberation before the public as all activist groups combined. Valerie lives is a cry being heard more often in one form or another from the mouths of affluent women to the etchings on public walls," end quote. So now still refused to help Valerie, viewing her as outside of the feminist movement and saying that she gave feminism a bad name. In protesting this decision, Robin Morgan organized a petition to raise funds for Valerie's release to a private institution where she would receive better care. Dunbar Ortiz found provocation with how now members rejected Solanas' brilliance because of her bad reputation and because of her mental illness. The objections to her was that it would give our nascent movement a bad reputation to defend someone who was crazy. At that time, crazy seemed like a pretty relative term. In 1968, the exact definition of crazy, with the government killing 100,000 Vietnamese every month, it just seemed like an odd argument for leftist people. That's the same logic they used against wanting lesbians, and now it would give them a bad reputation, quote. Valerie then posed a triple threat. She looked like a lesbian, and she was crazy, and she was violent. She was now's worst nightmare. So in early October 1968, after her falling out with Solanas over her provision of legal aid, Atkinson resigned from Now and founded the October 17th movement, a group of radical women aligned with the idea of upending institutionalized sexism. This action likely started radical feminism as we know it today, with Solanas as the destroyer and Atkinson as the brains behind it. Dunbar Ortiz said of Atkinson's departure, "It was a whole bunch of things. It was defending Valerie, also fighting with Betty Friedan's exclusion of lesbians and the quote-unquote lavender menace. Valerie was at the center of a lot of big fights," end quote. In a press release, Tigray stated her reasons for resigning as the Now chapter president. She said, "Since the beginning, there have been bitter schisms over taking unequal positions on certain issues: abortion, marriage, the family, and supportive persons in the cause who have crossed the law, Bill Baird, Valerie Solanas, the inextricable relationship between caste and class," end quote. An October 24th, 1968 article in the Washington Post reported that Betty Friedan had attempted to expel Atkinson from Now after the latter had appeared in court with Valerie following the Warhol shootings. Atkinson, who chose to leave Now, was asked why she had done so. She responded, "There was a whole series of things, including Valerie, the whole attitude, the panic, the abortion issue. I didn't want a hierarchy. I wanted a rotating president to diffuse power and encourage everyone's energies. You've got a revolution or you've got nothing. I didn't understand why. On everything I thought was really important, they were a drag, pulling back." Solanas rejected all further attempt from radical feminists for help. She had finally succeeded in alienating even the closest of political allies, leaving only a small handful of people who sympathized with or admired her. Dunbar Ortiz, the leader of Cell 16, once astutely said of Valerie, "Perhaps destroyers like her can never transform their energy, but only inspire others." Believing herself a writer, Solanas refused all claims on her political alliances or motives. Ben Morea offered an animated description of her central role and the role that the writing played in her life. He said, "She was 100% artist, 100% writer. It was always a part of the conversation and part of her life. Writing was her thoughts, her desire to communicate ideas. It came up all the time. It was just part of our conversation." In his view, quote, "She saw a need to raise a lot of issues about what happens to women, and the SCUM Manifesto was the best way she could express herself." Morea emphasized the importance of thinking of Solanas as a writer, saying, "The best I'd ever hope is that she'd be given respect as a woman of thought and a woman of letters, rather than as a maniacal killer. I would hope that people would see the creative, the important side of her and respect her for that. Of course, she was an artist. She had purpose. She was driven by a purpose. She saw a vacuum that she felt she could delineate," end quote. Giving his thoughts on Solanas and feminism, Morea recalled her distaste for liberals in general, and particularly for feminist liberals, saying, "She saw herself as a radical, just as I had disdain for political liberals because I considered myself a radical. She spoke of her disgust, how stupid they were, or how shallow they were, or how one-dimensional they were, but she never really came across as an angry person. She came across as a person angered by stupidity and angered by the situation that existed, but not as an angry person. I was much more like that than she was. She had a lot to contribute to the feminist political world and had a lot to offer that should be taken seriously. I had a lot to offer in my world, in my arena, to the political, artistic, and cultural world in general. Radical feminists who reject Valerie aren't radical feminists. It's a game. They're liberal. They were afraid to go that last mile. Radicals are ready to go over the edge. Liberals just go so far. She threatened them because she went all the way. She played out her conviction rather than just writing it. I played out my conviction rather than just writing it. That's the difference between radicals and liberals. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for inviting me. This was such a fun experience, and I really appreciate it.